Hello. Hey, welcome to the Canadian Water and Wastewater Association's National Water and Wastewater webinar series. This was in place of our national conference, which was supposed to be in Niagara in November. And instead, we broke it into a series of 8 webinars, all on the theme of Towards a Sustainable Utility. That concept began as a project of our utility leadership committee, creating a guidance document for all of our members to help lead them towards sustainability. Then each of our committees got involved in helping us improve that guidance document, and each of our committees took on to produce one episode of this webinar series. So we're excited that today is our drinking water quality committee has produced today's episode. I want to thank Steve Craig, their chair, and all the members of that committee for putting this project together. So this is the last of the 8. It's not the end of the series, because we're going to wrap all of this up on World Water Day, which is March 20th. I invite everyone to come to the closing plenary. There's no fee. It will be a free session. We'll get all the promotion and all the connections to you. But be prepared for World Water Day. It'll be a 1-hour discussion about how do we bring it all together. We've talked about 8 aspects of being sustainable. And we want to talk to a few utility leaders about how do they balance all those demands? How do we bring all those aspects together to be that sustainable utility? After that, come June, where we normally have our window on Ottawa, I think we're going to be virtual again. We're still holding the door open for now, but expect that it will be a virtual event. Either way, it'll be hybrid, but we're looking at that event in June, which we co-host with the Canadian Water Summit, which is put on by Water Canada magazine, and the Water's Next Awards. So look for that information coming in June. And then we're all going to be together again one day soon. November, Niagara Falls. We're going to do it again. Niagara Falls in November for the National Water and Wastewater Conference. So I really look forward to seeing everyone there. So for today's episode, just to look around quick, over here, you'll see a chat zone. If you go to the chat, you have a couple of choices. You can go to the public. It'd be great. Say hello right now. If you are just watching, go into the public chat and say, hi, it's me from Winnipeg. Oh, I'm calling in from Nova Scotia. Let us know who's there. You can talk to each other in the public zone, or click on private. You can see who's here, and you can send anybody a private message. If you have a question that you would like the panel or any specific speaker to answer, go to the Q&A. You'll see Q&A there. Click on Q&A and please type your questions there. We won't see them in the chat. I'll only see your questions if they're in the Q&A. Great. Said, a big part of being able to do these webinars is having a sponsor. Today, I really want to express my thanks to the Walkerton Clean Water Center. Walkerton's been a huge supporter of CWWA for many years. The involvement of their members on our committees, especially on this drinking water committee, has been immeasurable. Walkerton has a big part in my life. Many years ago, I guess it's, I think we're celebrating 20 years now. I got an opportunity to do a master's degree at Western. I went down there after 10 years in municipal government to do municipal law. I was going to write the best parking bylaws ever. And then the Walkerton crisis occurred, and my director was named to the inquiry, and he needed somebody to help work on water policy. And all of my master's program was worked on water policy against my will. And now here I am leading the Canadian Water and Wastewater Association. I don't know, did I even say my name at the beginning? I don't know. If you don't know me, I'm Robert Haller, and I'm the executive director. So that changed my life, everything about Walkerton. And now Walkerton's name is more synonymous with the expertise and the training that they put on to help everyone in Ontario, and their resources are available across the country. Here, really honored to have with us today is Carl Kunke. Carl, I had no idea how amazing you, like I meet you all the time and I always enjoy talking to you, but we've got to sit down because Carl, when I got to read your bio, Carl is the CEO of the Walkerton Clean Water Centre. Like I said, it's the Ontario government agency that trains drinking water operators and develops technology for drinking water issues across the province, including Ontario's 134 First Nations. After 20 years as a Canadian ambassador in 5 different countries, and then work in Ottawa, he left for the private sector and co-founded technology firms on the West Coast. He returned to public service as the leader of Saskatchewan's Centre of Excellence for Infrastructure, and he returned to Ontario in 2017 to lead the Walkerton Centre. He truly adopted Walkerton as his home, where he lives with his wife, Beth, and their rescue dogs, Zoe and Pippin, and he's really active. He's an appointee to the Brockton Police Services Board, a member of the Brockton Economic Development Committee, and a board member of the Residential Hospice for Grey Bruce. Welcome, Carl, and thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Well, my time is up, so thanks, everyone. No, quite seriously. I appreciate being here, and the Walkerton Clean Water Centre sincerely is thrilled to be able to sponsor this event. As Robert said, we are all about drinking water quality. Between our training and certification of every single drinking water operator in this province, and also our work with the 134 First Nations, we are a fairly unique model in Canada. And stay tuned, we're looking to expand the model. But we'll have to stay tuned for that over the next coming months. We are thrilled to be here, and I am thrilled to sponsor, as is my agency. And I'm going to keep it short because I have the pleasure of being able to introduce Steve Craig. Many of you, most of you would not know I'm from Edmonton, where Steve is from. He's the Director of Quality Assurance and Environment with EPCOR Water Canada, based in Edmonton. And Steve's probably not even old enough to know that when the Gold Bar wastewater plant didn't even exist across that bridge, I was driving my Honda 350 SL motocross bike in sanctioned Honda races. And that's back in the 70s. So that's how old I am. Anyway, Steve has 21 years of teaching and practical experience in the areas of municipal drinking water and wastewater treatment. And he just happens to be, not by coincidence, the chair of the CWWA's Drinking Water Quality Committee. So I'm going to keep mine short, turn it over here. Again, we're thrilled to sponsor this. If you have an issue with water, and I say this for anyone in Canada, you do not have to hesitate to contact us. We have a 24/7 drinking water resource library on our website. It's available to anybody in the world. We have daily inquiries and questions about drinking water from places as far away as Senegal, Russia, Finland, you name it. And that certainly means that anyone in Canada is allowed to go onto our website and use it also. And I look forward to this afternoon's session. Over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Carl. And I am old enough, but I just haven't lived in Edmonton long enough to see you riding around on your, what was it, Honda, but around Gold Bar. So sustainability, I guess, for a sustainable utility, you can't really have a sustainable utility unless you have a sustainable source of water, water supply. And that's what this with this session today is all about. It's about source water protection. So we've got speakers from right across the country here, starting in Victoria with Oliver Brandes, followed by Steph Neufeld here in Edmonton, my home in Edmonton, and then moving to Ontario with Tessa Diorio and Mary Wooding, and finally ending up in the Ville de Montréal with Mary-Claude Besner. And they're all going to be talking about source water protection and a kind of a different flavor in the different kind of jurisdictions and areas that they work in. So this will be a great set of talks that we're going to go into. So without ado, I'll introduce our first speaker. So our first speaker is Oliver Brandes. He's with the Polis Project, and Oliver Brandes, he's an economist and a lawyer by training and a transdisciplinarian by design. He is the Associate Director of the Strategic Partners and Public Policy at the University of Victoria's Centre for Global Studies. Oliver serves as co-director of the POLIS project on ecological governance, where he leads the award-winning POLIS Water Sustainability Project. His work focuses on water sustainability, sound resource management, public policy development, ecological-based legal and institutional reform. He's also an adjunct professor in the University of Victoria's Faculty of Law and the School of Public Administration, and he is a fellow of the Environmental Law Centre. Oliver is a technical advisor to the BC Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy, supporting the ongoing development of the Provincial Water Sustainability Act. He also provides ongoing advisory support to the provincial government and Indigenous nations on issues of governance and water law for watershed governance. He is also a founding member and chair of the National Forum for Leadership on Water, or FLOW, and an advisor to numerous national, provincial, and local governments, water funders, water organizations, including First Nations Fisheries including the First Nations Fishery Council, Freshwater Legacy Initiative, and the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources. Take it away, Oliver.
Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, if you're on the West Coast. I appreciate that introduction. I guess they sent you the long version. I'm going to start by, with respect, acknowledging the Lekwungen people on whose traditional territory where I work, live, and play, and the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Moshannock peoples whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. For this, I'm thankful. I'm also in the Colquitts watershed, which is in Victoria, which is a local success story of exactly the kind of themes we're talking about. It's a place where when I moved to Victoria and started doing some work on restoration, had no salmon, and now I live on its banks, and there are salmon that have returned in this highly urbanized watershed in a very functional way. I'm going to let anybody alert me if they're not seeing what they should be seeing or not hearing me properly, but here's my presentation. I'm going to give you the BC perspective, but remember my angle, which is a law reformer, very interested in governance and how we make those structural changes. So it'll probably be a little less practical from a technical perspective, but it'll show a view of how BC governs and manages its source protection and how we might move forward, really. I'm attempting to switch slides here. Let's see. So this is a bit of an overview. I'm going to give you the BC Water Issues Tour. I think it'll look familiar to most Canadians, but there'll be sort of a BC flavor. I'm going to give you the 101 on BC water law and policy, and hopefully make the case for something different. I'm going to tell you a cautionary tale of the Halkar Aquifer, which really represents both when things go wrong from a source protection and what you can do to begin to fix it. And then I'm going to end with a little bit of gazing into the crystal ball as we talk about the opportunity and potential of a watershed security approach or an agenda, which is currently on the political mandate of our new government here in BC. So I'm going to start with, the usual laundry list of issues. Again, will look familiar to most of, I think, people across Canada. We have things like, I call it the nitrate time bomb. We have cumulative effects and community unrest in Peachland as we see logging and upstream activity. We see fish protection orders where you actually have to truck fish because the waters are so low, and you see impacts on drinking water that come from these low levels. You see droughts intensifying. You even have a concern from the Auditor General and various government reports that are not surprising. From a drinking water perspective, I think it's important to recognize BC is perhaps a little different than some, because we have this interesting blend of a great many systems, 4,800 water systems kind of by last count, with a whole range. We have significant boil water orders, which again is not shocking, and increasingly weather-related short-term advisories. What we do see in BC specifically is the majority of systems serving a small number of people, where the majority of the population really receives their drinking water from very large, extraordinarily professionally run systems. So, in my simple world, I've kind of categorized this in three categories. We got these really sophisticated programs with certified operators, professional engineers, And these are in the large urban areas. And that's where the vast majority of British Columbians live. And then you have a number of areas, maybe more regionally, with high quality water sources, usually groundwater or controlled sources. And then you have the vast majority of systems serving very small populations and these very multiple or intensive use water sources. So the good water source protection is probably the best in the world. And some of the broader mix across the province are probably some of the more severe or more threatened. What we see, I think, BC's story from some of our experts, pretty standard, probably aligns with lots of national work, that we have small water suppliers with inadequate treatment, difficulty attracting and retaining those certified and trained experts. The ability to access the kind of science and laboratory facilities is challenging. The insufficient resources to make upgrades to the water system and the lack of control of upstream activities, especially source protection, becoming really the crux of the problem. And this is well documented, so it's no surprise to anybody. It's well understood. And this is sort of my flavor of it. What we're seeing is certainly watersheds under pressure. So beyond just drinking water and source protection, we see the standard list of climate change, population, resource extraction, growing demands, over allocation, at the same time as we see BC going through a fundamental shift. And you can see the drought list there, and I call it the Californication of the West. We see issues that 10 years ago, when I did some of the early work and some of the research we did at Polis, where we would compare to California, and people told me I was crazy. There was no way that was relevant. I did it for a bunch of very interesting legal parallels, but now the climate is beginning to match that reality. So climate change is no longer a might happen, it is happening. And so what do we do about it question. I'm not alone in some of this concern, and I like to draw this out because this is a recent Auditor General review of drinking water in BC. And it's rare that these sort of independent officers use strong language, but they were very clear that there's grave concern and there's a real breakdown in some of the accountability and siloing that's highly problematic. So that's kind of the BC snapshot. I don't think it's that different than much of Canada. Some of the specifics are a little bit different. But now I'm going to sort of change channels a little bit and talk a bit about the BC water law and policy context, or sort of how the system works and maybe where we need to go with it. The first, of course, is, there's a number of key elements, not just legislation, but some of the key policies. We talked a little bit about Walkerton to open the session. BC, of course, responded at that same time, and that's what set in motion what's known as the Action Plan for Safe Drinking Water, which was a very sophisticated, very visionary kind of approach. That was in the early 2000s, with an emphasis, of course, on a multi-barrier emphasis, and it was to ensure safe, reliable, and accessible drinking water for all. So a very laudable goal. And we've all learned, all Canadians have learned, all around the world, we've learned the importance of our provincial health officers. And the provincial health officer plays a very important role in oversight, but has an ongoing set of reviews where we see these systematic gaps. So this vision was never quite achieved. We see the province shifting, and in the early or 08 is when a Living Water Smart, which is the provincial policy, which provided a really broad vision, not just of drinking water, but of fresh water more broadly. And what was interesting about this policy, and I review policy from all around the world and across Canada, is it represented what I call the next generation of policies. It wasn't just an environmental policy. It wasn't water as just part of the environment, but a cross-government priority. It had linkages to economics, to agriculture, to land use, to energy futures, to health, to community sustainability, etc. So it came from the Premier's office and had this cross-cutting importance. And that set in motion the law reform piece that sets up the Water Sustainability Act, which was brought into force in 2016. And this is my little bit busy, but schematic or picture of BC's water laws. And it's really to emphasize that As we all know, water is an immensely complex issue, both from a management, but also from a governance and a legal perspective. And when we start thinking about water law in context, you can see a whole myriad of different jurisdictions, federal, provincial, local government, they each having some rules and laws. And then, of course, in Canada, as we are coming to a reckoning, a reconciliation with themes such as UNDRIP and the need to understand better and recognize our Indigenous partners, that Indigenous water laws play an important role. So we have both Crown and Indigenous water laws, and how this will get resolved in the future will be a big challenge. But in the context of the Crown laws and the British Columbia laws in particular, there are 4 that stand out from a source protection perspective. And I've circled them in the red lines here. And they are, of course, the Water Sustainability Act, which I'll explain a little more just to demonstrate its potential. And then a few other acts, including the Environment Management Act and, of course, the Drinking Water Protection Act. And we see, of course, many equivalents across the country of similar kind of legal structure. The specifics of the laws and how they're arranged, of course, vary, but this is the BC approach. And, this is a comment perhaps on some of my legal friends and partners, that when water lawyers think about water, this is mostly what they think about. They think about the bare minimum of water to keep a fish alive, and they think about the water that comes out of your tap. They don't yet think in a very integrated way. They don't think yet about a whole of watershed approach or that integration, the source protection, when we think about the upstream, the land use, what are the legal and institutional tools to better manage that before we begin thinking about the liability and the processing that comes at the treatment stages. And, the new Water Sustainability Act, which is now 5 years old, but has changed fundamentally some of how BC both governs and deals with water. The big change, and this may be a surprise to some of our friends and colleagues across the country, BC did not regulate groundwater until this act came into effect. So it extends surface and groundwater. So it began closing the water cycle from a legal perspective. So all the water managers know, of course, that we think about groundwater and surface water and even upstream and downstream in an integrated way. Well, legally, we did not. It also created some legal protection for environmental flows and better linkages out of the water column. So not just thinking about water in the water column, but what are the upstream activities that impact the water? As we all know, the activities on the landscape all show up in the water. And so the legal regime began being able to address that. In British Columbia, we have a system called FIPFR, first in time, first in right. We all know about this from our days in kindergarten. It's basically the I had it first principle. And that's how the legal system worked in Canada and in the West in particular. And in BC, this idea of what your date of your license gave you your priority. Of course, there was a big void because Indigenous people's water use is not recognized. And that creates a huge tension, a legal friction, and a legal fiction that needs to be resolved. But in addition, this creates a kind of incentive not to necessarily conserve. And we see some what I call off-ramps that better define beneficial use in a broad sense, not just an economic sense. And I can go into that more detail if people want during the question period. And of course, as common in Canadian law, we see lots of enabling provisions for planning and shared or delegated governance, which offers a foundation for a new partnership style model and better spaces for Indigenous engagement on water issues. But we have yet to realize that. So that's kind of an overview of the legal structure. I just want to emphasize that there's critical linkages between this environmental flow notion and Indigenous rights and uses. And in fact, many are making the argument that you can't actually achieve many Indigenous rights and uses without getting a proper handle on an environmental flow approach or regime. Of course, like much of Canada and indeed parts of North America, of course, and globally as well, you see a huge gap between the words on the page, the laws, the policies, and the implementation. It's not surprising BC faces the same challenge. So now I'm going to tell you a little story that I'm familiar with. It's a region in BC in the interior. It's a place called the Halkar, and I call it a bit of a whodunit mystery. We have a drinking water problem, and we have some suspects, and we had to try and resolve this. The first thing is to note where it is. You can see on the left there a map, and you can see a little blow up of this aquifer, the Halkar Valley, a prominent growing area, lots of agriculture, and a nitrate problem that had been mounting over a number of years, coming to a real crisis point about 5 years ago. What you see is a lot of confusion and complexity, and I'm very intimately aware of this because of my role in providing an independent review of what happened here and how we resolve it. What we saw were 5 key provincial ministries really wondering who's in charge on this source or this drinking water problem. We see, the usual suspects, I think, when we talk about land or dirt ministries, Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Environment, what we call FLNRO or Resource Ministry here, and also the Indigenous Ministry. And we see a number of interagency working groups, but we really have a lack of clarity about whether this is a health problem, a pollution problem, or is it both? And adding to the complexity and the confusion is a number of institutions and bodies, including the local water district, local government, interior health, and of course, a layer of scientific uncertainty. As often is the case with groundwater aquifers, we don't fully understand the dynamic. We don't know about the time lags. We are uncertain about what remediation, and we do know that it's going to be expensive. And a real sense of this nitrate time bomb, meaning actions that are happening often only show up in the water sometimes 3 or 5 years later. And this created a real conundrum and a lot of confusion, and really laid bare the gaps and concerns in the source program. In a nutshell, when I'm trying to explain this to ministers, this is how I do it, with some pictures. And I really say, listen, we had some real problems. We've got local drinking water compromised. We see intensive farming, poor manure management resulting in high nitrate levels. We don't have the sufficient testing and monitoring, and the low understanding of how that groundwater dynamic comes. Only after the crisis arrives do we begin to address that. This is amplified by poor communications, both between the provincial and federal governments and with community, where the local voices become or feel or are ignored, feel frustrated, and create a real local crisis situation. This set in motion this independent review that I was able to lead and reported directly to the minister. And now I'm going to lay out some of the solutions, which I think have significance, both in emphasizing that much of it could have been avoided. So we have what by my sort of running count is a multi-million-dollar problem that could have been avoided with relatively early action and a little bit of early warning. So at pennies on the dollar. And I think what shows or reveals where some of the governance and legal and institutional gaps are that need to be addressed if we're going to take source protection seriously, both in BC and arguably across Canada. So the key pieces in trying to fix this sort of sequence of events is the sort of 5 kind of pillars are around the importance of that planning. In BC, we call them nutrient management planning, really to drive those best management practices around storage, transport, and application of manure at that farm level. We see the lack of that integration of an area-based approach. We have a number of tools available in the various laws that I've outlined that require or that enable better monitoring and enforcement. They need to be deployed. We need that local perspective through that Halkar Water Board that needs to be created. And we have a number of really innovative technical solutions that include, for example, manure biodigesters that can turn some of the waste into something quite positive. So I'm seeing that I'm on my home stretch here. This is just a point to emphasize that we want to really think about a comprehensive approach. So I have a couple of key points, key learnings from this review, that this kind of source protection is just the tip of an iceberg. So this one region has the problem, but this problem is sort of lying everywhere across the province. that the siloed and fragmented nature of BC yields some of that problem, and that we have a real opportunity because source protection really drives the interests of ministers and a number of communities as they want to resolve their water issue. So my gazing into the crystal ball will be my last slide. I'm going to skip over this one and really emphasize, which is well recognized by the current government, that watershed security is a priority both for the public and that there's an inevitable governance component with it. This is this watershed governance interface beyond just getting the details and technical aspects of drinking water right, but to really think about this mix of expertise, science, traditional knowledge, rules and enforcement, and citizens and local control, including co-governance, to address the problem. And I will leave you with this last thought about what I think the future really looks like when we talk about water. BC is going through this transformation. Well, when we think about resource management, we really need to think about the mix of scarcity and risk that has changed, uncertainty that's not going anywhere, and how we respond with which is really with resilience and a whole systems approach. So.
Well, thank you very much, Oliver. I just want to remind everybody that we're going to be doing questions and answers at the end of the presentation sessions. So hopefully, Oliver, you can join us for that. Appreciate your presentation, but we will be moving right on to the next one, moving kind of slowly across the country, driving into the sun from BC into Alberta now. So I'd like to introduce Steph Neufeld. She's with EPCOR Water Services and in Edmonton. And Steph has been a watershed manager with EPCOR since 2008, where her focus is on drinking water source protection and managing the cumulative effects of EPCOR's operations on the North Saskatchewan River, which is the source of drinking water for Edmonton. Steph has worked in consulting as an aquatic biologist for several years before starting her career with EPCOR, and has taken on a number of board positions, including the president of the Alberta Lake Management Society for almost 10 years. She was a director of the Alberta Water Council. She co-chaired the Alberta Water Council's non-pollution and riparian project teams. She's a member of the Source Water Protection and Lake Conservation Management teams. She was on the Integrated Watershed Management Plan Steering Committee for the North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance, which is a Watershed Protection Advisory Council in Alberta, and on the Red Deer Watershed Alliance board, and was involved in the Bow River Phosphorus Management Plan. So she's been all around the province. Some of Steph's highlights include spearheading the North Saskatchewan River Watershed Monitoring Program, which is a brand new monitoring program, and providing leadership in Alberta through the development of a number of source water protection plans. So she lives and breathes source water protection. So take it away, Steph.
Great, thanks, Steve. Even though I've spent a lot of my time doing governance work, this talk is not going to cover governance at all. There is some major planning issues with coordinating land and water planning in Alberta. And so I've written a lot of documents on that, and that's not what I'm going to focus on today. I'm going to do exactly opposite of Oliver and focus on filling in knowledge gaps. Before we can do source water protection, we really have to make sure that we have a sound science-based knowledge of our watershed function through time in order to do appropriate risk assessments and understand where we want to focus our time. So my focus on this talk is really on this inventory of land use contaminants and vulnerability assessment and ranking. So not on the planning aspect, but what's happening in our watershed, why, how is it changing through time, what are our biggest risks, and how will we address those risks as a water utility. So the watershed that we are talking about in this area is a lot larger than many watersheds people may have worked on from a water utility. It's 28,000 square kilometers, and you can imagine the different land uses, land cover, watershed processes that would occur when you start in the Rocky Mountains and you get all the way down to very agriculturally dominated land. It's a source of water for over 1 million people. And again, it's often said it's glacially fed. It starts at glaciers, but it is not. Most of the water does not come from glaciers. In fact, less than 2% of the annual flow is from glaciers, but most of it is from snowpack in those headwater regions. So in the areas in the upper watershed, we see that most of the water, the pie chart, is almost full by the time we get, a quarter of the way down the watershed. And most of those areas downstream of Edmonton are non-contributing areas, so water doesn't really flow off those landscapes. And we know where water flows, that's how contaminants move. And so understanding those flow pathways becomes very important in understanding how water quality will change under different climate change regimes and overall. Now, this is a regulated river. We have 2 dams on the river. One, the Bighorn Dam, it was put in 1972, and the Brazeau Dam in 1961. And it's really changed some of the water flow conditions on the North Saskatchewan River. So really, we've moved from these high summer flows to lower flows as the water is held back and released a little bit more in summer. We've essentially in winter, we've essentially doubled the flow in the winter months. And all this becomes very important when we're looking at determining how source water quality and quantity may change in this context. So when we look at source water protection, essentially what we do is we look at various landscape level factors that could affect water quality now and in the future. And there's multiple competing land uses in a watershed this big. And I think Oliver touched on a lot of the ones in his BC watershed, but they're different, and there's different processes depending on where your watershed is or where your utility is. We have a big oil and gas sector. One of the most developed and linear disturbed areas in the world is just upstream in Drayton Valley. We have a large forestry sector. A large percent of the watershed is currently forested. If you looked at human footprint or human footprint index, about 30% of the watershed is impacted. So 70% pristine is the other way to say it, relatively pristine. And that's really means our watershed is in good shape, and it's particularly protected or pristine in the areas where water comes from. And that becomes very important when you look at potential risks to source waters, is that the greatest disturbances are where the influence is the least. Even in the upper watershed, agricultural land use is 14%, and most of that flow comes during spring freshet when that part of the watershed melts. But water quality generally is dominated by snowpack and snowpack patterns and runoff in those upper watershed areas. So when we take all of the data together, and in our source water protection plan, we have probably 30 maps looking at different land use covers, different drivers, linear disturbance, oil and gas, rails, pipeline crossings, transmission lines, agricultural land cover, land use, urbanization, all these factors that contribute to changing water quality or impacted water quality at our intakes. When we put that all into a risk matrix in our source water protection plan, we have inherent risks, things that if we didn't treat the water, what are the biggest risks to the river in general? And then the residual risks end up being things that we highlight that we don't have controls for. And one of the examples is, small urban wastewater systems contribute, and there is a high inherent risk, but because of the robust nature of our treatment plant, that becomes a low residual risk. However, something like a pipeline break, we don't have a lot of controls for. That can render the whole system having problems with treating water depending on the duration of the spill, and the magnitude, and in some of the past work, it's shown that this can occur for months. We can have degraded water quality in systems for months, so that is identified as a risk for us. So if we take all this together, our key source water risks identified were climate change, wildfires, and spills, things that could occur that we don't have a lot of control over from a treatment perspective. There are certainly things that we can do, but the risks remain high. So I'm really just going to focus on how, on one of those risks, climate change, and how we've addressed that. And we've addressed it through understanding and filling data gaps, and then developing a climate change adaptation strategy to mitigate and manage those risks. And so we've partnered with a park out of the University of Regina, Dave Sachin, and looked at where have we been in the past? In the last 1,000 years, where have we been? What is the natural hydroclimatic variability of the river? We have a change in climate coming up. We know that, but where have we been? And if we put climate change on top of that, how is that going to affect our water supply and water quality? So we've learned lots of things from this data set. Is that we settled Alberta in the wettest period in the last 1,000 years, and that water flow in the North Saskatchewan River is not static or has never been static. And we have had drought periods of up to 100 years. And so understanding that the water quantity in the river is not a static resource is critical in our planning. So from there, we looked at, okay, if we had existed in this time, how much water would we be withdrawing if we were withdrawing the most amount of water that we've ever withdrawn? It's typically around 3% of the flow in the North Saskatchewan River on a daily basis, and we would get up to 22% of the hypothetical annual average flow if we looked at the worst weeks in time, and we get quite high in some weeks. This is not considering dam effects. So it was just giving us, is water quantity a supply, and is it going to be a supply issue, and is it going to be a further issue from climate change? So what we expect in the North Saskatchewan River is often different than others are expecting for their watersheds. We're expecting more water, and that the timing of that water will shift, and that we will get an earlier melt, and that we'll get less flow in the summer months when we typically get higher flows, and that may have implications for our management. So those projected climate change impacts with increases in temperature, increased precipitation, and then that timing of precipitation will all affect our water quality and quantity. The fact that we would get more intense storm events, higher turbidity events in an already very turbid and changing river could impact our ability to treat water, or at least the costs of treating that water. And if we get more precipitation as rain in earlier snow events, we may not be able to do direct filtration during those times. So there's also these greater landscape level changes that could occur in terms of increased wildfires, moving from changing ecoregions as that migrates across, and those ecoregions migrate across our watershed. And so when we have these climate events that occur, we can have impacts on both water quality and quantity. And we are managing that and modeling that so that we can make sure that our infrastructure keeps up with those changes through time. And that's sort of our focus. So it's an iterative process for adaptation planning. So what we've done is we've kind of figured out, well, what's the state of climate change knowledge on our river? What can we expect, knowing that science is ever evolving, especially climate science is ever evolving, and we can't predict perfectly, but we can set ourselves up on the right road to do that. So the first step is to understand projected climate change impacts and challenges, and I think we've done a pretty good job of that. And then assess how those risks would affect our ability to treat water and provide water, and then come up with some adaptation options, whether it's alternative water supplies. And so in the next couple slides, I'm going to kind of go through how we've done that. In the kind of idea is that in our adaptation strategy is each of those will have different strategies. And if we looked at, say, river flooding, from changing climate, how would we address that? So the work that we've done, the specific actions that we've done, is updated flood hazard maps, developed implementation of berms around our critical infrastructure, and then scoped out alternative drinking water distribution plans and source plans. So each of these sort of risk statements around climate change has a specific action plan around that. So when we look at, so for each of these risk statements, we have an adaptation strategy around that. And so I talked about the river flooding impacts. And so we want to make sure in our climate change adaptation strategy, we have actionable items that we can do, whether it's improving the science or the knowledge, or actually putting in measures to mitigate for actions such as berms around our water treatment plants. So when we have things like poor water quality after intense rains, what are we going to do? Are we going to have to put gray infrastructure in? Are there things that we can do for green infrastructure around stormwater? Is there restoration activities in the upper watershed that might be beneficial? Wetland restoration, riparian restoration, and for each of these climate change impacts, do we really understand what could happen, and are we really building resiliency? And so actionable adaptation strategy items around each of these. In some of these risk statements, a lot of these risk statements is developing the science, and I think I really focus on that this aspect in this talk is, and in our source water protection plan, of which the 2020 version is coming out in a few days here, is understanding the science behind that requires appropriate monitoring and appropriate modeling. And to fill those data gaps is no small feat. And before we can get to some of the governance issues, and I think Oliver touched on those governance issues, we really need to understand the science and do appropriate risk assessments and develop those tools before we have a problem. Understand what each of those contributors are to source water quality and quantity, including climate change, but the whole multitude of other drivers of water quality and quantity. Model it into future scenarios, understand it, and then plan. And I think oftentimes we get caught in that governance structure without looking at some of the science. And this is one example. The climate change adaptation strategy is one example of how we're trying to address that in terms of actionable items. So when we talk about integrated source water protection in Alberta, we're working on developing Alberta-based tools to make sure that we can delineate watersheds appropriately. We've at EPCOR and in the city of Edmonton, we've done that because we've are far advanced in source water protection, but other municipalities need that. And then again, when we do an inventory of land use contaminants, that seems easy, but that includes a suite of land use maps, and then the understanding of how those land use implications and land use contributions affect water quality, not just historically, but in a predictive way. So that's developing predictive models that look at changing landscape under changing climate and how that would affect water quality and quantity, and then adapting our facilities to manage that. And when I take this, one small example of climate change, there's a whole suite of monitoring, modeling, research that goes into that one aspect. And once we have gained some understanding, we can assess our risks and then reassess our risks as that knowledge changes. So without filling those data gaps, our risk assessments lack rigor and lack scientific rigor, and so we can focus a lot on governance structure, and I think we have to do that at the same time, but also focus on that science and gaining that understanding. And once we do that, in Alberta, we take a little bit of a different approach maybe than other jurisdictions, because we don't develop a source water plan where we're developing the plan. We essentially piggyback on the already existing strategies in Alberta. And in Alberta, those are guided under Water for Life. And those are through the establishment of watershed planning and advisory councils. So some of the issues with those are that they're not authoritative in the fact that they have really no authority for land and water planning and implementing things on the landscape. We also work collaboratively with other land and water planning groups that are I guess, supported legislatively through the Alberta Land Stewardship Act and through the development of water management framework and regional plans. But again, there's a lack of general integrated land and water planning in Alberta and federally in many jurisdictions as well. And so our approach at UPCOR in source water protection planning is to integrate into each of those planning activities, influence where we can, and try to mitigate and manage source water risks. And I think I have a little bit more time here, so I will kind of highlight one other issue that maybe some of people have heard, and that's the recent coal policy changes in Alberta. And this is one highlight where kind of all the headwater groups kind of talked about source water protection and how we need to understand how coal is going to affect source waters, and essentially the sky is falling. And I think we realized quickly that the data that is available in terms of, what's happening on our landscapes in terms of actual having collaborative models and validated calibrated models that can predict changing landscape issues, whether it's coal mining or agricultural land use change or climate change, wildfires, all of these things, having a modeling tool that allows us to definitively and predictably understand how these changes are going to affect water quality and quantity such that we can do planning effectively are lacking. And the governance around those are also lacking. So, we've come a long way, and we're continuing to come a long way through influence, but there is still a lot of work to be done around source water protection planning in Alberta. So I guess I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Steph. As I mentioned, I'll just remind everybody we're going to be taking questions at the end of the session. So Steph, stick around for questions at the end. We'll move on to our next speaker, or it's actually two speakers. We're going to head right across the prairies here, all the way to Ontario for our next talk. So our two speakers are, firstly, Tessa Diorio. Tessa is a risk management official and inspector and hydrogeologist with the City of Ottawa, and works with the city's asset management branch of infrastructure services in the Department of Planning and Infrastructure and Economic Development. As the City of Ottawa's risk management official, Tessa is responsible for implementation of the Part 4 policies under the Ontario Clean Water Act. And Tessa is also a hydrogeologist and supports development review at the city. Additionally, she manages various groundwater-related projects to support informed resource management. Prior to working for the City of Ottawa, Tessa worked for a conservation authority for 11 years and managed technical studies to support source water protection planning. Mary Wooding is with the provinces of Ontario. Mary currently works with Ontario's Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, and the Conservation and Source Protection Branch. Mary represents the Crown as the provincial liaison officer for several source protection committees in their implementation of the Clean Water Act. She supports and assists provincial government ministries with their responsibilities of implementing source protection policies under the Act. And in her 25 years plus with the ministry, Mary's duties have included drinking water inspector, where she inspected many drinking water plants in Eastern Ontario. So Tessa and Mary, take it away.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to jump right in, and Tessa's going to follow up at the end. So let's keep going here. Okay, well, we'll skip this. This is just the overview of what we'll talk about in our next 20 minutes or so. So the Clean Water Act, as was stated in the introduction, the genesis of the Clean Water Act was the events that occurred in Walkerton in Ontario, in the Ontario town of Walkerton in May 2000, where the town's drinking water became contaminated with E. coli. Can everybody see the presentation? There we go. Thank you. So after those tragic events in Walkerton, Justice Dennis O'Connor led an inquiry, and out of that was 2 volumes of reports and 121 recommendations. And the passing of the Clean Water Act directly fulfills 12 of the inquiry recommendations and supports 22 of the other recommendations. So you can imagine there could have been a crisis of confidence, but the strong response to the recommendations and the subsequent comprehensive drinking water framework was developed, focusing on prevention. The framework is a source-to-tap approach. It includes health-based standards, regular testing and reporting, licensing, and operator certification and compliance. So the Clean Water Act and its regulations form part of the legal framework. The Clean Water Act is a multi-stakeholder, collaborative, locally driven, and has a rigorous science-based process to protect drinking water sources. So it requires mandatory inclusion of municipal drinking water systems, and other systems, drinking water systems, can be added by municipal council, and that includes First Nation systems, and 3 of them have been added to date. It identifies activities that are human-caused anthropogenic activities on the landscape that pose the greatest risk to drinking water sources, and they are then prohibited or managed through local source protection plans. So there are a few threats examples noted there. So the source-to-tap approach, source protection is the first step in ensuring Ontario's communities are confident in the quality and quantity of their drinking water. So there's a number of general reasons why protecting sources of drinking water is important. The one reason that Oliver talked about in the whole car is it is often more cost effective to prevent water from becoming contaminated than it is to treat it. And the supply of water is not infinite, and groundwater can be depleted if water is taken out of the ground more quickly than it can be naturally recharged. So this slide illustrates the Clean Water Act and the associated regulations. So the reference to Ontario Regulation 205 under the Safe Drinking Water Act in the bottom left corner was a regulatory amendment. So this requires any municipal drinking water system to ensure they complete the source protection technical studies, and the source protection plan for that area is updated and approved by the minister before the municipality is able to supply water to the public from a new well or an intake. So the scope of the Clean Water Act. So the purpose of the Act is to protect existing and future sources of drinking water. So it's requiring activities that could be a risk to be assessed and addressed. And examples of that would be agricultural runoff of nitrogen fertilizers, which was talked about, and could lead, this obviously leads to excessive dissolved nitrates. So the Clean Water Act builds on existing legislation, regulations, and processes to manage or eliminate risks. By relying mainly on existing policy tools, the Clean Water Act ultimately relies on partners with other stakeholders for implementation. So the Clean Water Act provides municipalities with the authority to regulate activities that may pose a significant risk to their drinking water systems, which couldn't be addressed by other planning tools or regulatory instruments prior to the Clean Water Act. So and requiring certain decisions made under legislation like the Planning Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, Ontario Water Resources Act, and the Nutrient Management Act to conform with the significant threat policies. Importantly, where there is a conflict between the Clean Water Act and other legislation, the most protective of drinking water applies. So I'm just going to actually jump ahead of this one. I'll explain this in the next visual slide. So there are 38 watershed-based source protection areas that are broken up on this slide. And each source protection area has a source protection authority. It's basically the conservation authority based on the watershed area. And there are 2 additional source protection areas or authorities that were added. So there's a total of 38 source protection authorities, and they're grouped into 19 source protection areas and regions. So the example that I will point to is the lime green sections in the middle of this map, and that's the Trent Conservation Coalition, consisting of 5 source protection areas. So in 2007, the source protection committees were established for each of the 19 source protection authorities in the 19 areas and regions. So as of 2016, all the source protection plans were approved and are currently being implemented. Source protection plan policies apply to vulnerable areas, which currently includes protecting about 440 municipal drinking water systems, where the majority of Ontario population gets their drinking water, as well as the 3 First Nations drinking water systems. Okay, so this is our key partners. So obviously the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, the ministry maintains the legislative framework and collaborates with other ministries. The Source Protection Authority, they maintain the source protection committees. They develop the amendments to the source protection plans, which I'll talk about. They undertake annual reporting and maintain all the administrative functions to support the committees. And they support municipalities in fulfilling their implementation obligations. And in so many ways, they support the successful implementation of the local plans. The source protection committees themselves are responsible for preparing the local assessment report and plans. They have a chair that's appointed by the minister. The committee members make up local representation in those communities, make up 1/3 municipal representation, 1/3 economic, which is agricultural, commercial, business, and industrial, and 1/3 of others like environmental NGOs, health, the general public. So I am the ministry rep that sits on 6 of these committees, as was mentioned, and there are 12 committees that have additional seats dedicated to First Nation representatives where there's reserves in those particular watershed areas. And the committees currently meet about 4 times a year. So the cycle, the source protection cycle, is basically identifying that the cycle starts off with identifying risks. The source protection plan is the strategy to address the risks, taking action through implementation of the plan, and monitoring through annual reporting, and renewing the plans when required to add new systems. There's a good deal of consultation at all those levels. So the science in the assessment reports, this is the weighty work of the science and is found in the assessment reports. The assessment reports set out the technical information related to the drinking water systems for that particular area and their vulnerable areas, and includes the risk assessment. It includes maps and identifies activities that pose a threat to sources of water. They're completed in accordance with the director technical rules, and the director technical rules set out the rigor, the science-based framework specifying the technical methodologies to be used in assessing the risks and the vulnerabilities. So the assessment report includes an assessment of how vulnerable groundwater and surface water are to contamination with quantity and quality. And this assessment is based on local characteristics, based on the watershed characterization, vulnerability issues at the water systems, and the threats assessment. The 4 vulnerable areas that are identified are intake protection zones, wellhead protection areas, highly vulnerable aquifers, and significant groundwater recharge areas. This table identifies the 22 prescribed drinking water threats in the Clean Water Act. So there are 20 quality threats, And in the lower right of the table, you will see the two quantity threats that include consumptive taking and activities that reduce the recharge of an aquifer. Water quantity. So this is the water quantity analysis. The amount of water available and how much water in and how much water out determines the stress level. So there are 3 levels of complexity that are required, beginning at the watershed scale, with the technical analysis becoming more complex if concerns about water quantity related to a municipal system are identified. So tier 3 is the most detailed level of the assessment. And there were less than 30 of these tier 3 studies that were completed in the province. So the source protection plans, the plan is actually the action. It's comprised of the policies, and as mentioned, the assessment report with all of the science forms part of the source protection plan once it's approved. And the plan includes policies that prohibit or manage the threats. The implementation tools include land use planning approaches, which could include studies to support Planning Act applications or low impact development measures. Provincial instruments, an example for environmental compliance approvals and permits. Risk management plans is a new power under the Clean Water Act, and Tessa will be talking about that. And education and outreach, and other specified action policies as well, like septic inspections and road salt reduction plans, pollution prevention, and emergency spill plans. So it's mandatory to include policies for significant threats and optional to write policies to manage moderate and low threats. So plans that also include monitoring policies, and this is not environmental monitoring policies, it's monitoring of the implementation of the policy. Yes, so one of the specified action policies that the committees wrote requested the Ministry of Transportation here in Ontario to install road signs. So there are over 100 drinking water protection road signs across the province. The source protection review cycle. So it is a cyclical approach. So the source protection planning allows for the renewal. So there are a few ways source protection plans are amended or updated. So one reason a plan is amended is when municipalities need to add or alter a drinking water system, and that could include a new well or intake. And as I mentioned earlier, in 2018, under the Safe Drinking Water Act, municipalities are not able to supply water to the public until the source protection studies are completed and approved and form part of that source protection plan. So other amendments could include land use, adding land use and drainage changes that could create transport pathways, and all the new information improvements in science and understanding, and addressing policy implementation challenges. So another way plans are updated is through a minister's Section 36 order under the Clean Water Act. So additionally, the ministry is developing a guidance document to ensure communities and individuals have the tools they need to protect their sources of drinking water that are not currently included in the provincially approved source protection plans, such as privately owned drinking water systems. So the guidance will utilize known source protection information and to provide a range of simple yet cost-effective strategies to protect sources of drinking water and manage risks for those other type systems. So this is my final slide. There are reporting obligations to monitor and report on implementation. So there are obligations on the provincial ministries, on municipalities, and source protection authorities to report. So the progress is reported annually and summarized up into the minister's annual report. As they say, if it isn't measured, it isn't managed. So now I'll hand it over to Tessa Diorio from the City of Ottawa to give a provincial perspective.
There. Thank you, Mary. Like Mary said, Mary talked about sort of that framework, the legislative framework that was provided by the province, and I'm providing you a municipal perspective. So my name is Tessa, I work for the City of Ottawa, and I'm the City of Ottawa's risk management official, which means I implement Part 4 policies under the Clean Water Act. So the first sort of point that I wanted to bring up was the Clean Water Act was a very powerful piece of legislation for municipalities. The Clean Water Act gives the municipalities the power to protect their own water supplies. And this power is given by allowing the Clean Water Act allows municipalities to regulate or manage activities on private property. And this was something that wasn't there before. So it's a very powerful piece of legislation. The other piece that was really nice from or good in constructing source protection plans was that that each one of those plans are locally developed. So Mary had said there's 19 different source protection regions. The province provided the legislative framework and the rules. So the province provided the rules, and then committees were formed in those 19 regions, and they decided on the policies. The province identified the policy tools, either be prohibition or incentive programs, but it was local committees of municipal representation, public representation. So it was these local committees that decided on the policies, and that had a lot to do with the uptake of the program in general. So to give you a little background on the City of Ottawa, so just this is, I implement policies, source protection policies in the city. So in this map, you can see that I have 2 source protection regions. The black area outlines the city. We have the two areas in gray. There's 2 different source protection regions. That means I implement 2 different source protection plans. So the City of Ottawa is about 3,000 square kilometers and a population of about 1 million. We get the drinking water from the main for most of the urban area and suburban area comes from our central servicing, and those are the 2 intakes in the Ottawa River at Britannia and Lemieux. And that purple area identified, that's our intake protection zone. So in that area, that's the area where policies apply to protect that drinking water source. And that is a 2-hour time of travel. So it just means within that sewer shed, if there's a spill under certain conditions, the contaminant might reach the intake within 2 hours. So that's where we have policies that apply. We also have 6 different municipal wells, and you can see them identified. I won't name them all, but you can see the colored areas are the wellhead protection areas. And so these were all science-based areas that are identified. So although those areas look like they're quite large, the areas where the highest restrictive policies apply only cover about 3% of the area of the City of Ottawa. So like I said, our source protection plans took legal effect in 2015, and just talk a little bit about the implementation of those plans. So when the plans came into effect, the assessment reports identified the science. So they drew the lines on the map where policies would apply. And also part of that assessment report was the identification of existing drinking water threats. And when we went through that assessment, we found that most of the drinking water threats within the city are already managed by prescribed instruments. So those are instruments that are already taken care of or already managed through a provincial ministry, such as the Ministry of Environment or the Ministry of Foods and Natural, or OMAFRA. So some of those threats might include the sewer infrastructure, fuel storage at the water treatment plant, or stormwater ponds. So those already have instruments, and so it's the instrument that covers the source protection policies in that place, in those cases. In terms of other work that the city does, we are in the process of conforming our official plan to make sure that zoning coincides with what's permissible in certain areas. And then in terms of risk management, the work that I do, there's 3 main things I wanted to talk about quickly. The first is the negotiation of risk management plans. So these are threats that are not covered by prescribed instruments. So that in our area, it includes fuel stores, so residential fuel stores, where we negotiate a risk management plan with a private resident. And the plan would just say something like, you're going to maintain your fuel properly, you're going to have it annually inspected, and you're going to report on it to us, and you know what to do in case of a spill. And another part of my job is screening new development applications. So whenever there's a new development application in a vulnerable area, I would screen it under Section 59 of the Clean Water Act to make sure that there's no significant threat in that area. If there's a significant threat, risk management plan ahead of time before that activity is permitted. And finally, the City of Ottawa also runs our own outreach and education program to make sure that residents are aware of the program and are aware, if they live in a drinking water protection zones, things that they can do to be a good water resident. So finally, I just have 2 slides. So these were provided by Mary, and if she doesn't mind, I'll just quickly talk about, I don't know if Mary wants to talk about them or I can talk about them, but there's a lot of resources provided by the ministry and the city as well. You can go ahead, thanks. And the first one is the Source Protection Information Atlas, and I'm happy that I can talk about it because I actually use this one quite a lot. It's a public-facing interactive mapping tool, so and you can go on it, the address is there. You can go on to it, put in any address in Ontario and find out quickly if you're within a source protection region. You can have access to that, the source protection plan in that region, find out if there's a vulnerable area. Are you in a vulnerable area? Where is the closest one? And you can find out the policies that apply in those areas. And the final slide just has a number of other resources. So these are other resources if you want to learn more about Ontario's drinking water source protection program. So that's it, and thank you for listening today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tessa and Mary. Great presentation, and hopefully you'll stick around for our question and answer at the end of the next talk. So we'll move on to our final talk for the session today. We'll head to just down the road now to Montreal, and Mary-Claude Besner will be presenting. So Dr. Mary-Claude Besner works as an engineer for the Service de l'eau at the City of Montreal, where she specializes in research development and risk analysis. For 2 years, Mary-Claude was an honoris postdoctoral fellow with US EPA, where she was involved in defining research needs to better assess public health risks associated with water quality degradation in distribution systems. She previously worked at École Polytechnique and as a researcher, and her work has been published in several journals, including Water Research, Environmental Science and Technology, AWWA Journal, and in 2019, she received the George Warren Fuller Award for the Quebec section of AWWA. So take it away, Mary-Claude.
Thank you, Steve, for the introduction. So, and thanks also to CWWA for inviting me to present during this webinar and talk about source water protection in the province of Quebec and especially in Montreal. So we've traveled all over Canada today, and so with very interesting presentation. And so we're finishing up in the east, and so let's see what's going on in Montreal. So Montreal is an island. Its population is about 2 million people, and so we do have 6 water treatment plants that are using surface water as their source type of source water. And so we do have 5 of our plants that are located on the St. Lawrence River, and 1 on the north side of the island on the Des Prairies River. And so the Des Prairies River is fed from the Ottawa River, and the Ottawa River is also feeding the St. Lawrence River as well. And so in terms of the capacity of our water treatment plant, so our smallest is 68,000 cubic meters per day, and our largest plant has a capacity of 1.4 million cubic meters per day. And the average daily production is about 1.5 million cubic meters per day for our 6 water treatment plants. So today I'll be talking about source water protection in the province of Quebec. So I'll show you an overview of our regulations. So I'll talk about the requirements and the guidelines that we are provided with to perform vulnerability assessment. And so I'll be targeting specifically today surface water intakes because this is what we have in Montreal, but there's also requirements for groundwater as well. I'll also be talking about the delineation of intake protection zones. So you'll see the acronym IPZ throughout the presentation, and also the inventory that we have to perform within these protection zones. I'll show you the main challenge that we found with the guidelines that are provided to perform the vulnerability assessment in the context of applying these in highly urbanized areas, such as in Montreal. And finally, I'll show you briefly the approach that we took to try to achieve some sort of a standardized risk evaluation. So the Quebec regulation for source water protection is called the Water Withdrawal and Protection Regulation. So it's been published for the first time in 2014. And so it requires that all municipalities that are supplying drinking water to a population greater than 500 people, they must perform a vulnerability assessment of their source water intakes. And so there's about 500 of these municipalities in the province that has to do this work. And so we were provided by the Ministry of the Environment guidelines on how to perform the vulnerability analysis, as well as what should be included in the report. And so this report has to be transmitted to the minister every 5 years, so it has to be updated. And our first round of report is due on April 1st, 2021 at the latest, so in a couple of weeks. So what should the report, what is the content of the report? So first of all, we have to characterize the withdrawal sites. So basically, we have to provide a description of the site, as well as the water treatment plant and the treatment processes that are in place. We have to rate the vulnerability of the source water through the assessment of physical and water quality indicators. So I'll show you on the next slide what this is exactly. And we also have to delineate intake protection zones. After that, we have to perform an inventory of the threats within these intake protection zones, and finally perform a risk assessment of the identified threats. So for the rating of the source water vulnerability, so this is done through the use of 6 indicators. So the first one is related to the physical integrity of the site, and the others are related to water quality. So we're looking to the vulnerability of the source water to microorganisms, fertilizers, turbidity, inorganic and organic substances. And these analyses are done with data that we collect as part of the water quality regulation that we have in Quebec, and we must use a 5-year period to do the analysis. And these analyses are specified within the regulation, so how to do the assessment and how to set the level of vulnerability. So it's textually in the regulation. And so, for example, if we take the turbidity indicator, so the regulation says for a consecutive 5-year period, so if the value of the 99th percentile is equal to or greater than 100 NTU, then the vulnerability of the source water must be set to high, otherwise it is classified as low. So we do have these criteria for these 6 indicators, and as well, alternative methods also provided if insufficient data are available within the utility. And so with that, we can classify the vulnerability as being either low, medium, or high. And then for the medium and high classification, we must provide the potential causes that could lead to this level of vulnerability. And then for the delineation of the intake protection zone, so there's 3 types of protection zones. The first one is the inner, so the closest to the intake. We have the intermediate and the outer protection zones. So and the delineation depends upon the type of water course. So if we take the case of a lake, so the principle behind it is the definition of a radius around the intake. So for the inner protection zone, it's the 300-meter radius around the intake, which includes the surface water, the portion of tributaries, as well as a 10-meter strip of land. So this is what's indicated in red in the figure on the right. For the intermediate protection zone, the radius is expanded. So it's a 3-kilometer radius, again, including the surface water, portion of tributaries, and then a 120-meter strip of land. So this is indicated in orange. And for the outer protection zone, it's the whole catchment area that must be considered. So if we take the case of the St. Lawrence River, or other type of water courses, such as river or creeks. So instead of a radius, now it's a distance that is used, so distance upstream and downstream of the intake. So for the St. Lawrence River, so the inner protection zone would be 1 kilometer upstream of the intake and 100 meter downstream of the intake. And so we have to take both sides of the waterway. And again, this includes the surface water, portion of tributaries, and a 10-meter strip of land. So this is as shown in red. And for the intermediate, so this is expanded to 15 kilometers upstream, and we do consider the 120-meter strip of land. And by the regulations, there are some activities that are forbidden in the inner and intermediate intake protection zone. So for example, in the inner protection zones, activities such as grazing, spreading, or storage underground of animal waste to form compost, sludge from municipal wastewater treatment plants are prohibited. And in the intermediate protection zone, activities related to the exploration or production of hydrocarbons are also prohibited. So you do have here the result of the delineation of the intermediate intake protection zones for the 6 water treatment plants in Montreal. So this is the gray shaded area. So as you can see, the territory that is included within the protection area goes well beyond the territory of the island of Montreal in itself. So we are touching several municipalities on the north, on the west, as well as in the south of the island. Then in the protection zones, we do have to do an inventory. So within the inner and intermediate protection zones, we have to look at the elements that are likely to affect either water quality or water quantity. And in the outer protection zone, we have to look for the elements that are likely to significantly affect the water quality or quantity. So we do have to look for human activities. So in any industrial, commercial, agricultural, domestic public utility activities that may release contaminants into our source water, as well as point source discharges, such as, for example, wastewater treatment plant outfalls, sewer overflows, industrial discharge, creek outfalls. The second category are the potential events, so any release of contaminants from accidents or extreme climatic events that could affect the water quantity. And so this means also looking at the storage tanks, warehouses with hazardous substances, transportation corridors, and the last category is the land use. And once we have done this inventory, so for each threat that we identified, we have to perform a risk assessment. So this means that we have to assess either the frequency or the probability of an activity or an event to release contaminant, a specific contaminant into our source water, and then assess the gravity of consequence in order to reach a level of risk this is done with a matrix. But then for the evaluation of the consequence, the guidelines requires that we consider a worst realistic case. However, this case is not specifically defined in the guidelines, so it's each person that is performing the risk assessment that has to define his own scenario. So the main challenge that we identified by applying the guidelines to perform the vulnerability assessment is that in the context of a highly urbanized area such as we have in Montreal, to perform the inventory only within the intake protection zone. So you have it here in the yellow, the strip of land. It only provides some sort of a limited knowledge because yes, it can be quite easy to identify wastewater outfalls, stormwater outfalls locations. But then when you have to characterize the possible flows that could be coming out from these outfalls, the possible type of contaminants and their characteristics, it becomes very difficult because you do not have any information. So there's no other way than going upstream into the sewer sheds in order to really identify the real threats to to our source water. And so you do have here the territory covered by storm sewer sheds that have their outfalls within our intermediate intake protection zones. And so for sure, the territory of inventory significantly increased, but nevertheless, we don't really have the choice, because this is required in order to better understand the real threats to our source water. And so we entered into a research partnership with École Polytechnique in Montreal. So they were the ones who performed the vulnerability assessment for our 6 drinking water sources. And so we also asked them to develop a methodology to try to achieve some sort of standardized risk analysis. So this methodology includes the taking into account the inventory based on sewer sheds rather than only in the intake protection zone. It includes the definition of worst realistic case scenario, as it is required by the guidelines. And in the end, it ended up being some sort of an open source methodology. We made it available such that other water utilities could use it if they desired. And this with the goal of in the future, being able to compare our risk analysis on using the same hypothesis between different municipalities. And so the developed methodology, there are 6 issues that have been addressed, some sort of standardized. So the first one is how to assess the microbial risk from effluents of wastewater treatment plants, how to assess the risk from sewer overflows, risk from recurring industrial wastewater discharge either to sewers or water bodies, risk from non-point source pollution, and finally risk from accidental release of stored hazardous substances or release of hazardous substances during transportation. And the methodology for each of these issues, it provides the type of data that are required for analysis, the definition of a worst realistic case scenario, the method to assess the risk to the water intake, and finally the criteria for risk classification. So you do have here an example of results. So this is the risk from sanitary overflows or combined sewer overflows. So what is illustrated are the combined and sanitary sewer sheds that have an outfall within the intermediate protection zone of one of our water treatment plant. And so what we are now able to do is that we're able to classify these sewer sheds in terms of their risk for water quality at our intake. And so in that case, the highest risk we got, the highest risk level that we got was a moderate one. And this they took into account the number, the duration of overflows over a 5-year period, as well as the population within each sewer sheds. Another example here is the risk from non-point source pollution. So what's included in this analysis is the zoning of the territory, the location of contaminated soil, as well as their status, and location of snow dumps. And again, this here is the storm sewer sheds that have their outfalls within the intermediate protection zone. But again, we are able to classify these in terms of their risk to our water intake in terms of water quality. And then in that case, you can see that we had sewer sheds with level such as high and very high risk. And this allows us to prioritize our actions either from increasing some sort of monitoring or some targeted actions that we would like to do. We would go there first in order to minimize these risks. So in conclusion, as I said, well, in province of Quebec, there's a lot of action, I guess, at this time, because there's only a couple of weeks left. So all the municipalities must provide their source water assessment by April. And as you saw in highly urbanized areas, so some sort of a different approach was needed to really better understand the threats that source water we had with our source water. And finally, the proposed approach allows for some some standardizations of the risk analysis, at least for 6 important issues. And it also allows for the prioritizations of sewer sheds in terms of their risk to our intake for the water quality. So it is. So thank you, and I look forward to answering any questions during the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. Excellent presentation. So I'd like to invite all our panelists to come back and join us. Turn your mic, your cameras and mics on, and we'll get into the panel session. First, I want to thank all the speakers. Excellent set of presentations. Quite a bit of diversity in their presentations, and I think that's one of the things we wanted to achieve here today. I would remind all the participants out there, everybody listening into the webinar today, to use the Q&A function, which you'll find on the right hand, the menu on the right hand side near the top, Q&A, and put your questions in there, and we'll try to pick them off and ask our panelists. I'm going to start off with a question of my own, if I might. One of the things that strikes me about all this, despite the different governance models involved here, there's quite a lot of a technical aspect to source water protection. And Steph, you mentioned the science, the importance of science, and Oliver, you talked about the governance. So the question that I have is, how do small, you say middle size or even very small utilities manage all that technical challenge, to determine to develop a source water protection plan, determining vulnerabilities, doing scientific assessments. So Steph, maybe I'll ask you, since you kind of put out the word science.
Sure. This is a very big challenge in Alberta. So the larger municipalities typically have good, robust source water protection plans and the science and the funding to back research. The smaller municipalities are challenged with that. So the Alberta Water Council, which is kind of a policy governance group in Alberta, is developing a web-based platform for source water protection. So I forget who had talked about their mapping tool. I think, Mary, that was you who had talked about that mapping tool, and it was similar in that there would be a web-based portal so that any municipality could, one, delineate their source water by clicking on their area, whether it's an aquifer or a watershed, and get appropriate land use maps. So we have GeoDiscover in Alberta, and there's lots of land use data, GIS mapping, but municipalities either lack the tools or the resources to get that done. So to make it available in a web-based platform with training tools, how to use GIS, how to interpret the data, and then that water quality and quantity data linked in there as well. And one of the key aspects of that is that technical training. A lot of municipalities don't have biologists or water quality specialists on board, so they really need to understand how to interpret that data to assess risk. And so your ability to manage risks is only as good as your ability to interpret the data. And so we had recommended that AEP take on that role, but there's a lot of capacity issues in Alberta. So it's really at least providing one place where municipalities can go and get those resources as quickly as possible, and web-based. And so that project is going forward. So that's the answer that we have in Alberta. We don't have the answer, but we have a plan to get the answer eventually.
So Mary or Tessa, do you want to try answer that for the context of under the Clean Water Act in Ontario? How do small or even medium-sized utilities manage source water protection plan development and all the technical requirements?
Yeah, the approach that Ontario has taken was to sort of capture those larger utilities and municipalities in mostly Southern Ontario, but Northern Ontario is less covered. So one of the things I did talk about was the guidance that we're developing that will provide tools that are simpler tools, more cost effective. The Clean Water Act, the way we've done it to date has cost the province about $285 million. So recognizing that that's not something that's doable for all. So the tool that we're putting forward, we're hoping will assist municipalities and other drinking water systems in that regard.
Okay. How about Oliver, do you want to address that for BC? You mentioned a lot of small systems in BC, many systems, but a lot of them very, very small.
So the interesting thing about BC, as I tried to outline, was, you know, if you take just a rough sense, probably 60% of the population has some of the very best source protection, because where I live, the Capital Regional District, they outright own the watershed, right? So they are actually managing the watershed to maximize water quality. So sort of a poster child globally, and Vancouver is somewhat similar. And then you have these sort of myriad of really small systems. And the short answer is, in almost all cases, not all, but almost all cases, you are dealing with crown land upstream in the source. And so there is simply no way that the local small municipality or local government can actually do much without the provincial interaction, meaning the designation, and there is legal provisions to create community watersheds for drinking water sources, where you would have different activities and permitted activities, and that will have to come at that sort of landscape planning stage. You know, and the answer is, how are they doing it? They're doing it by muddling through. A crisis arrives like Hulkar, and you spend a lot of money trying to retroactively fix it. We're hoping that obviously pivots.
Okay, thank you, Oliver. Mary Claude, in Quebec and in Montreal, you mentioned you had the Polytechnique was helping with the vulnerability assessments. For the other smaller utilities around Montreal or in other parts of the Quebec, is that a workable model as well, or do they need to go to different places to get vulnerability, those assessments completed?
Well, in Quebec, we do have what is called in French is organisme de bassin versant, which is some sort of watershed group, you know. So there's about 40 of them for each watershed, except for Montreal. We don't have this type of group. And so I know that several municipalities have contracted with this group to perform the vulnerability assessment because of their knowledge of their watershed. So.
Okay, thank you. All right, we'll go to a different question. We'll go to the Q&A here. So we've got a few lined up. This one's headed directly for Ottawa. So Tess will be ready for it. What is the major issue around source protection in Ottawa? And then do you exchange any, I think it's exchange any information with other municipalities involved in the watershed?
Okay, that's a good question. In terms of implementation, it's actually been quite smooth. We've had a lot of, it's mostly been smooth. Like I said, most of our significant threat activities were already covered under prescribed instruments that were managed by the province already. I think one of our sort of residual issues is, remember, this is I guess the issue is people were on their private properties. They did things a certain way, and then all of a sudden this policy comes by and it says, okay, now you have to change. Now the activity that you were doing before is now going to be managed. So we do have a few, we had buy-in from most. We do have a few residual sort of non-compliant individuals who don't want to follow the rules. So like I said, the Clean Water Act gives the municipality the power to go and force somebody to do something, but rather than taking that step, we're going to sweeten the carrot. So we're still not moving towards the stick yet. So we're trying different incentive programs to get more buy-in from a few residual people that won't negotiate a risk management plan just because they are generally they don't trust the government. So we're just trying new incentive programs. So I think we will get there where we're like 99% done. We have that 1%. So that's I guess the biggest issue we have right now. The other question was, do we have sort of exchanges with other municipalities? So the rule we have, and we're actually putting in our updated official plan, is that if we have a source protection area, so a drinking water protection zone from a municipality that comes into our municipality, we offer those same protections. So in our area, we have a municipal well, so our wellhead protection area that comes into the city of Ottawa, and we implement policies in our municipality. So we will offer the same protection because their drinking water protection zone is in our municipality. We would protect that zone just like we would protect our own zone. So, and part of the rules too are that when we screen a development application that's within a drinking water protection zone of another municipality, we also provide notice to that municipality saying that there's a new development that's coming on, we've screened it, there's no significant drinking water threat, it has been approved, and then we can have discussions that way. So there is a good discussion, and we have good relationships with our surrounding municipalities as well.
Thank you, Tessa, for that answer. I got another question coming from the Q&A. A lot of you mentioned risk in your presentations, and risk assessments and risk matrices and so on. So this one goes to you, Steph. In Alberta, you put I think a risk assessment on one of your slides where you talked about inherent and residual risks. You had both, and maybe you can explain what you mean by residual risks in particular.
Well, it's not an exact science. Risk assessment is not an exact science, but residual risk is if all your treatment is in place, what risk remains. So things that you can't control. An inherent risk is generally what the water would be entering your drinking water system if you didn't have treatment exactly. So, microbial pathogens are a good example. Usually we have robust treatment for that, but something that we wouldn't have robust treatment for would be a hydrocarbon spill. And if you don't have robust treatment for it, and you get, uptaken into your plant, you can have plant shutdowns for extended periods of time and cause, major concerns for water supply. So that because you don't have any controls in place, your residual risk remains high. Does that answer it?
Yes, thank you. Yeah. We'll move to back to Quebec with Mary Claude. Mary Claude, it looks like you're representing the entire province of Quebec, not just Montreal. So the question says, are all types of drinking water systems required to undertake source water protection planning in Quebec, either ordered by the province or the municipality?
Well, I know there's people from the ministry that are listening to the webinar. With the regulation, I'm familiar with the Category 1 water system, which is all Category 1 are the systems that are supplying more than 500 persons with drinking water quality, and with drinking water, and at least one residence. In the regulations, we do have Category 2 and Category 3 water systems, but this I could come back with a specific answer because I don't want to misinterpret what's in the regulation.
Okay, thank you, Mary Claude. Going back to the Q&A here. This is, I think it's particularly aimed at our folks from Ontario here. So Mary, Tessa, has there been a situation where a production well has been decommissioned? How was that implemented between the date of decommissioning and administrative approval? Very pointed. So I think Mary, is that?
In my particular area, can you hear me? Yes. Good. In my particular area, I haven't not dealt specifically with a decommissioned intake or well, but trying to figure out, the question is asking, it would be essentially when the system is decommissioned, when the intake or well is decommissioned, the vulnerable zones would be gone. And that would require the source protection plan to be updated. So one of those, that section 34, when the municipality comes to the ministry and says, we want to update the plan. So it would be removed from the plan at that point, either during a section 34 or during a section 36 update of the plan, either amendment or an update. I hope that answers the question.
I'll see if there's any response in there. But in the meantime, I'll ask another different question. And this was one of my own. Oliver, you mentioned FITFR in your presentation, and you touched on in your slide off ramps. So what's a FITFR off ramp?
Good. Someone was paying attention. So FITFR is a system where you basically have an ordering. How do we give priority, right? It's not by use, it's by date. And so this is very problematic. As you can imagine, some of the oldest licensed users in BC are often hay or lower value kinds of activities, and newer things like, I don't know, vineyards or some municipalities or whomever will have more recent licenses. And the FITFR system says the oldest license gets all their water until we run out of water, and then the newer ones are cut off. Well, now there are provisions where either through water sustainability planning or short-term crises like droughts or fish protection orders that basically create a reordering, a temporary reordering, so that not just the oldest license gets all their water and everybody else runs out of water. Because from a society cohesion perspective, that doesn't work very well. It's a great system when you have a large abundance of water and small users. It's not a good system when you move to, as I tried to outline, a Californication, where you're moving from a abundant, large supply of water to a scarce, very seasonal, tight supply.
Great. Thank you, Oliver. The next question coming from the Q&A is, it's a pretty broad one. Do you have any challenges implementing source water protection plans? For example, getting buy-in from various stakeholders, agricultural, commercial, manufacturing, industries, First Nations, the public. Maybe even, I'll add to that my own sort of flavor, the utility managers. Getting interest from your own utility managers and trying to implement source water protection plans, making it a priority. Does anybody want to take a crack at that one? That's a very wide open one. Artessa, thank you.
I just like to give a really big shout out to the ministry on how they organize their program, the source protection program, because a lot of the reason that the success of Ontario's program was the high degree of public consultation that went on at the beginning. So as policies were developed, there was a lot of public consultation. And again, the ministry provided sort of these policy tools, but the source protection plans were actually decided by local committees of economic representation, so economic, municipal, and public. And I used to sit on a source, I worked for a source protection region before I moved to the city, and it was a very agricultural region, and they just made sure that when they developed their source protection committee, that there were 2 agricultural representatives, so they had their voice heard. And I think just having all that public consultation up front really improved the success and the uptake of the program in general. So big shout out to the Ministry of Environment on that one, because it was the way it was set up, just sort of it made it so much easier to have buy-in from the public.
Yeah, I would just say the local approach was so important.
I'm going to pick up on that thread because certainly BC has a long acrimony and some global level conflicts around forestry. So it's not specific to source protection, but I think there's a bit of myth debunking, right? No trade-off exercise will create harmony and happiness. There is conflict. It's how you resolve the conflict. And I think the point being that the front end design on the governance, the rollout process, who's going to engage, what their voice means is hugely valuable. You do that well, then you can get to the trade-offs. Not everybody's going to be happy, but they can be satisfied or willing to live with the trade-offs because they've bought into the process. Source protection is no different than any of the key land use issues that are emerging across Canada, because we're going from basically an abundance system to a scarcity system. Source drinking water is just like all the rest. We used to have lots of abundance of good, high quality drinking water. Well, it diminishes. Ontario, Quebec have a longer history because they've had a concentration of population and activity through a longer period. So they've developed, not surprisingly, better institutions and laws to deal with it.
Thank you, Oliver. Steph, you got your hand up?
Sure. I just say in Alberta, we have a tendency to have this Western approach where we don't want any regulation, and we want stakeholder collaboration where we make decisions on how to best manage it. And how the provincial authority has really done that is set water quality objectives at different points along rivers. And for the North Saskatchewan, they've set one just upstream of Edmonton. And the idea is that it's maintain current water quality, and therefore they are going to do load apportionment. So everyone has their load apportionment that to meet those water quality objectives. And in theory, that is an excellent model. The problem happens is the science, where we don't have an integrated, calibrated model that looks at non-point source pollution effects. So you could have a trade-off model, but we don't have any data to back it up. You know, if you put a wetland in, that might be a better use of money than if you put gray infrastructure in, but there's currently no trade-off model that is allowing that to occur. However, having water quality objectives that for once set a limit on what we do on the landscape in terms of loads into a river, kind of set that framework. You can't put any more in, you can't continue to grow. And I think that's a real challenge for a continuous growth model, which we've had for forever. And now we're starting to set those limits, and now that those trade-offs become more important. Again, we're non-regulatory, so we're just expecting everyone would buy in, but now load apportionment can be regulatory under the Alberta Land Stewardship Act, so there's that opportunity under the regional planning process. We'll see how it goes, but at least we've set a limit, and that's the approach in Alberta.
Okay, thanks, Steph. Mary Claude, did you want to try answering that one too? That's the challenge.
It's expected. I mean, we're just at the end of the vulnerability assessment, so it is expected from the municipalities that they will produce a source water protection plan. However, it's not integrated into the regulation, so there's no need for us to submit this to the minister. So it remains to be seen how this will be started and where it's going to be going.
Yeah. So we're getting close to the end. I thought maybe I'd throw in a little kind of another open one to finish off with. It seems like across the country here, at least with the parts of the country that are represented, we've got very different systems for source water protection planning. From what I'd call, say, a voluntary type stakeholder-based thing in approach in Alberta to a pretty well-developed regulatory system under the Clean Water Act in Ontario. I think Quebec sounds like it's somewhere in between. BC is a little bit more like Alberta. I suppose the question is, others might be wondering, what's the best system? Do we have enough experience in Canada to say, what's the best way of doing this? Does anybody want to try to take that on?
Well, I can't resist the opening. I won't be long, but I think the bottom line is you have to decide what you're going to keep before you decide what you're going to take. And that's a basic plan. Anybody who's a planner understands that. And I think water has not benefited from that. We've just kind of either accidentally or followed crises because we're not really paying attention to what's falling in the water or what we're protecting upstream.
Okay. And Steph, I think you had your hand almost going up there.
Yeah, the Alberta Water Council did a jurisdictional review when we were trying to tackle non-point source pollution, and really source water protection is land and water planning. So whatever aspect you take from it, it's the same issue: watershed planning, source water protection planning. And they came up with a jurisdictional review because we often hear, well, Holland does it so good, let's do what they do, or Ontario does it so good, let's do what they do. And what we've really learned from that is, they came up with 10 kind of things that should have, and one of them was strong regulatory backstops, and that was clear. However, despite doing that, we presented that to AEP or a GOA, Government of Alberta, and they said, well, no, Alberta doesn't want to do that. And so it comes from both sides. We probably know what we would need to do to regulate pollution, but you do have to have the appetite for that in your province. And I think, we've kind of said in our source water protection, let's work within the existing frameworks and try to fix those frameworks. And I will say 15 years into this process, I'm getting tired of working with those frameworks because they're not effective. And so, I don't think that the issue is that we don't know what to do or what needs to be in place. It's the actual getting that in place and getting buy-in at the highest levels. And some have been more, Ontario was in our jurisdictional review one of the highlights, but there are obviously still issues in implementation, especially at the small scale. So, I think we would know what to do. It's that political buy-in and the recognition we cannot do everything on the landscape all the time in a continuous growth model. And I don't think we're willing to recognize that at this point.
All right. Well, Robert's here, so I think we better turn it over to him.